Fantastic. Great to see so many people here. I think we will start kicking off the webinar and people may join us as we go. Thank you so much for joining us today to Campaigning with Confidence. It's an NCVO webinar, but we're really excited today to be joined by Withers Worldwide, who are legal experts, and Roger is here as an expertise in charities and campaigning. Next slide, please. Just a few housekeeping rules for today. As you will see from the slide on here, there isn't going to be any breakout session today. There isn't going to be any time to pause. So if you do need to step away from the screen, if you need to go and get yourself a drink, please feel free to do so. As I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to see the recording on YouTube in a couple of days where it will be uploaded. Following the event today, we will send you the recording as well so that you can watch it at your leisure and you can share it with other people if you found things to be helpful. You'll notice that we have enabled closed captioning. So if you need the subtitles, please feel free to click on the section within the toolbar that's the CC icon, and that will enable subtitles for yourselves. Your microphones have been automatically muted to prevent any background noise, and none of you will be able to be seen on the recording. Today's is a webinar, so you'll only be able to see the people speaking. We're not expecting any fire alarms in my building. If there are fire alarms in yours, please obviously make sure that you follow those and leave the building. Please make sure that you respect each other. Obviously, the chat is enabled so that you can see who's joining us and if you do want to have conversations with each other, but please do respect each other. We do have a Q&A function, and at the end of today's webinar, we will have the ability to ask our speakers some questions, which will be chaired by myself. If during the course of the webinar you hear something and you want to know more about it, please use the Q&A function in order to ask the question. If it's in the chat, it will be really difficult for us to be able to pick out the questions because sometimes things get missed in there. So if you use the Q&A function, other people can upvote your question as ones that they would like to also hear the answer from. Next slide, please. Thank you. So today's agenda. This is a welcome from me. Apologies, I've forgotten to introduce myself. I'm Lara Bundock. I'm the Practical Support Manager from NCVO, and I'm proud to be hosting the webinar today. After this, you'll be hearing from two experts. So you'll be hearing from Chris Walker, who works for NCVO as one of our leads, our senior policy workers, and then from Roger Waite from Withers, who's one of the experts in legal practice around charities. Towards the end of this, we will have a question and answer section, as I've previously stated, and then we will give you some signposting of things that we've talked about during the webinar and places that you can go for additional support on campaigning. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about NCVO before we dive into the webinar. We're really proud to be the biggest kind of infrastructure body in the UK supporting charities across England. We have over 17,000 members. And so if you're not yet a member, we would really encourage you to join us because you'll be joining a peer network of amazing people around the country who are making a massive difference. Next slide, please. In terms of NCVO, you get huge amounts of support from us if you do decide to become a member. If you're a charity that turns over less than £30,000, membership is free. You'll get 30% off all of our training courses. This is a webinar that's obviously free to everybody, but we have some really in-depth training which we'll tell you a little bit about at the end of the webinar, and you can get 30% off of that. We also have support around governance and volunteering and strategy from our consultants who are experts in the fields and can work one-on-one with you. We also have a mentoring offer going on at the moment for our members that you can take advantage of. We also have a help desk where you can come to any time of the day, although we will only respond between 10 and 4. It's not a 24-hour service, but you can email us or you can leave a voicemail and we will get back to you about support in the things that you are facing. Next slide, please. Fantastic. So this is what you're here for today, is to learn a little bit about what it means to campaign with confidence. I'm sure everybody's aware that we are moving towards the general election and probably why a lot of people are here today. Your charity might be planning campaigning activity around issues that matter to you and need to be aware of what the rules are around what you can and can't do and what the freedom is within that. In this session, we hope that you're going to feel clearer about what you need to know about the charity and electoral law, what type of campaigning activity is regulated and what's not, and generally good practice when you're running a charity campaign. But before we get into the main part of the webinar, we're going to launch 2 polls just to understand a little bit about who is in the room today. To see how we can make sure that we apply what we're going to say to the people who are here. So the first poll that you'll see coming up on your screens is just about the size of the organisation that you come from. So if you could answer that when that appears on your screen, that would be fantastic. Great, Anna. Anna is our producer. Sorry, Anna, I can't see the responses. So when you feel like people have responded to the questions, if you could just release the answers, that'd be great. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So we have a few in the room that are the kind of the micro charities. The majority of today's audience seem to be from the 100,000 to over 5 million. So it's really great to see a spectrum of charities in the room. And thank you so much for answering those. The second one that you will see coming up is just about the nature of the organisation that you work for. Brilliant. Okay, we've got loads from other charitable purposes. Feel free to comment in the chat if you want to talk about what other charitable purposes you're here representing, so you can see if there are people from the same backgrounds as yourselves. Quite a few from social care and development, which is great, and some from human rights, environment, and then a couple here and there from accommodation, animals, armed forces, arts and culture, and economic and environment. So thank you so much for taking part in that. It's really helpful for us to know where you're from, what your background is. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to our first speaker of today. So thank you so much for attending. Chris, Roger, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much to Lara for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak here today. As Laura said, no one knows when the next general election will be called. And from this week's news, it sounds like possibly not even the Prime Minister knows. But what we do know is that it has to be by next January at the latest, and certainly it seems likely it'll be later this year. What that means is we are already in what's known as the regulated period prior to an election, in which specific rules and spending limits are in place for individuals and organisations like charities. And both Chris and I will talk through that in more detail later on. If we jump to the next slide, I'm just going to give a bit of an overview of the law as it applies to charities and campaigning. As with previous elections, I think there are likely to be a great number of issues and differences between the main parties on subjects that really matter to charities. Treatment of refugees, independent schools, the future structure, funding of the NHS, childcare in early years, as well as wider funding for education. And perhaps one of the more significant ones in this space particularly is anything around the environment and net zero. Charities have always had to navigate their way through political waters when campaigning to further their purposes, but even greater care is needed in this period in the run-up to elections. And I'm going to talk about the new rules and changes that everyone needs to be aware of. But before we get into those changes and the law around elections, I thought it would be helpful just to recap the general rules on campaigning, which apply at all times, general election or not. The first port of call for any charity, as ever, is your governing document to review your powers and any constraints on your powers. This is very unlikely to prevent you carrying out campaigning activity, but it's always best to check. There were some concerns as well in recent years about the provisions of contracts between central government and charities. So those of you with major contracts and funding arrangements with government ought to check those terms to see if there are any sort of restraints on what you can and can't do. Now, there's some controversy around the possibility that charities are sort of being muzzled over being criticised, even if criticising government if they're in a contractual relationship. But you do need to check and see what's there. But in almost all cases, charities can absolutely campaign in furtherance of their purposes. And at the outset here, I think it's useful to draw a distinction between campaigning and, as set out in the Charity Commission's helpful guidance on this topic, which is political activity. Now, campaigning is when charities promote or raise support for an issue within their objects. So an animal rights charity promotes kindness to animals, or a health charity publicises the benefit of a healthy diet. Legally, this is uncontentious, though of course charities can provoke and prompt debate sometimes with how they advertise and campaign, but that's a separate issue. Political activity is when charities campaign in furtherance of their purposes, but they're seeking to change the law or change the policies of government. So this is the animal charity advocating for more stringent safety laws to prevent harm to animals, or a health charity campaigning to extend bans on where alcohol and tobacco adverts can appear. A charity can only carry out this political activity in furtherance of its objects, but a charity can't have a political purpose. So an organisation established purely to change the law on assisted dying is not charitable. A charity can focus all of its resources on political activity for a period of time, but it can't become the fundamental reason for the charity's existence. And as you would expect, a charity also can't support a political party or support a political candidate. But the Charity Commission absolutely recognises that campaigning and political activity are really legitimate and valuable activities for a charity to undertake. And the new chair of the Commission, Orlando Fraser, has really emphasised this since his appointment. The Commission has also emphasised that it expects activity to be conducted with respect and tolerance as well. And you don't need me to tell you that there is a reputational risk if in charities getting involved in spats or in particularly sort of aggressive exchanges. But charities can provoke and prompt debate, and that there's all sorts of issues around that. But today I'm going to really kind of hone in and focus on what's the law on actually campaigning. And I'm not going to be overly political today, you'll be pleased to hear, but undoubtedly it's the case, I think, that the non-profit sector, like many other areas of society, has been affected by what one might see as a political polarization in recent years, and the evolution of how political debate's conducted, both how immediate and online it is, but also just frankly the manner in which it's conducted. And it doesn't take a legal scholar to tell you that organisations concerned with supporting refugees, charities campaigning to protect the environment, and charities involved in overseas aid can sometimes find it very difficult to keep themselves from explicitly or implicitly being part of that very charged political debate. And as we'll see, this issue becomes even more acute in the run-up to elections. And I'm going to cover later the legal position on that and the recent changes in this area. An important point as well relates to trustees and employees, who of course in their personal capacities are free to say and campaign as they wish for any political party. Needless to say, in the current environment, that freedom of expression doesn't come without some reputational risk for the charity. Now, the Charity Commission has recently published really helpful guidance on social media guidance, which I would recommend to anyone. And it contains really helpful comments on employees and differentiating between personal and professional capacities, say in social media profiles. And these principles can be really helpful, I think, in relation to elections and campaigning as well. And I would recommend that all charities read that new social media guidance. So before I get into the really exciting granular detail of election spending, I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's going to set the scene in a different way on what you can and can't do. Chris.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah, and as you say, I think one of the things we really want to do today is not just talk about kind of like what the law is, but also thinking beyond that as to what you can do, and hopefully leaving you with some really positive things to be thinking about in terms of how you'll do things. And I think, you know, and certainly understanding the law and sort of where it stands is a really big part of that. Can we have the next slide, please? So Roger mentioned that there's a kind of clear message from the Charity Commission, and I just wanted to emphasise that really. I think we've had lots of positive statements from the staff side of the Charity Commission, but also from the chair himself. So this quote in a speech, you know, felt quite important. So long as I'm chair of the Charity Commission, I will stand up for the right of charities to lawfully campaign. I guess one of the things we're here today is think about kind of like what does that lawfully mean? But worth saying as well that the chair has, you know, emphasised that, you know, potentially controversial action. So in fact, in that very speech, he recognised that the legal action that Care for Calais, which they've been criticised for quite a lot, sort of externally by sort of politicians, by the press, was a legitimate activity. So I think just really important that the Charity Commission has been really clear that charities can campaign, and that encompasses quite a wide range of potential activity. Next slide, please. So things you can do. This one kind of like comes up quite a lot around sort of commenting on policy, and it will become you know, even more frequent during the election. So essentially, you are free to comment on the policy proposals of parties. You can welcome them if they align with your thinking, and you can criticise them if they don't. Some things to think about here. So remember that you've always got to kind of like come back to kind of what is this central thing you need to do, and it's about being independent from party politics and being seen to be independent as well. So what you need to think about is, firstly, how best to achieve your charitable purposes, and that will often include commenting on policy. And then secondly, kind of like how might that be perceived by people, and say, how do we sort of want to phrase? So a bit of an example here from 2017 is that so a lot of charities were concerned about sort of potential social care policies, and had started using this phrase, dementia tax, for this idea that you know, people will be charged yeah, quite extensively to pay for sort of social care. Now that's absolutely fine. That's perfectly reasonable. You know, to have that kind of position and to sort of warn about a potential the potential charge on people. Now, when we got to an election, suddenly this became a massive policy issue. You had the Conservative manifesto basically announced they were going to go quite far down this route of charging people. And suddenly dementia tax was not just a policy comment, it was a political slogan that you had the Labour Party using. So charities that had this really consistent approach had to just start thinking about, well, okay, how can we still talk about this issue? How can we still use it? And the fact that they had that consistent approach and had already used it is obviously going to kind of help them in that scenario. But you do then have to think about, okay, well, how do we show that we're not just lining up behind what Labour is saying, and other parties as well? How do we make it really clear that this is our this approach for taking policy? So things you might want to think about are just making sure that the way you talk about things is quite constructive, it's evidence-based, it's really about the kind of experiences of the people that you're supporting, rather than it being kind of like on the political side. So a few things to kind of think about and be aware of, but to be really clear that you can comment on policy. You just need to kind of like think about how you might be perceived in the way that you do it. If we can move on to the next slide. Thanks. So charities are also very free to influence policy, and I think this is really relevant at the moment with parties that are looking at their manifestos. I think some are closer to finishing than others. But also thinking beyond the election as well. So you can have those conversations with politicians. You can be talking to them about what you want to see from the new government, and have those discussions about sort of what might change. A lot of this, it's a bit easier to manage in terms of that public perception issue, because you're not necessarily having these conversations out in public. This is the meetings that you're having with politicians. But it's worth thinking about how are we influencing across different parties. So what's your strategy to influence policy? Yeah, in different parties, and do you take slightly different approaches? And I think one thing that's important to say, again, just in terms of the freedom you have, you don't have to take exactly the same approach to different parties. So you'll have seen, over the last 15 years with a Conservative government, people have been very focused on influencing Conservatives and what their proposals look like. That moved in the public affairs world generally, but with charities as well. There's been a lot more focus on Labour in the last couple of years, and it's become clearer that they could win the election. And that's absolutely fine. But it's just making sure that you make those decisions based on reasonable criteria, rather than it being it could be perceived that you're favouring one party or another. But it's worth remembering you do have a lot of freedom in this area. Next slide, please. And this sort of really feeds into the way in which you engage with politicians as well. So really important times you're trying to build relationships with different politicians. So both political parties, spokespeople, but also thinking about candidates as well, and how you can engage with candidates. So if you there are some sort of like smaller local charities, I think, in this webinar. So for you, it might actually be just engaging with the candidates in the constituency where your charity is based, or in the area where your constituency is based. Others, so NCVO, for example, we are looking at the backgrounds of candidates and thinking who might work with us in a new parliament, who will be the kind of people that we want to be trying to engage with ahead of the election, just to give us a bit of a head start into building those relationships. As we have a photo of the NCVO and CAF hustings from 2019, a quick note on hustings, because that comes up quite a lot. So in terms of organising these, really important to have objective criteria in terms of who you invite. My general sense is that for a constituency hustings, you probably should try to invite all the candidates. That will be possible, I think, in most seats. Sometimes you get a very large number of candidates in some very prominent seats, but most of the time you're talking sort of 5 or 6 maximum. I think that's just it makes sense just invite everyone. If you're doing national hustings, you will have to have a cut-off of some sort. And again, you might use criteria about where they're standing. Do they have representation in Parliament already? I think you probably need to look at polling already as well. So I would say for most national hustings, there is a sort of expectation that alongside kind of Conservatives, Labour and Lib Dems, I think you're probably inviting Reform and Green Party as well, and then the SNP and Plaid Cymru, depending on sort of like where you're covering, I suppose, as well. And again, very similar, I think, in terms of the principles around trying to influence policy, that making sure you've got that approach which engages across parties and sort of demonstrates to be even-handed, I think is really important. Next slide, please. And I did want to have a quick word on this question, because it's come up in a few conversations. So you want to be really clear, staff and volunteers and your organisation can stand for election, and that's fine. But there are steps that you might want to take just to sort of manage the potential risk. to the reputation of the organisation. So firstly, I think anyone who is standing as a candidate, particularly in the general election, needs to be discussing with the organisation how they go about it. Then the organisation may take kind of some steps to mitigate risks. So things that I think charities will be thinking about at the moment is separating sort of political and work social media, which you probably want to do anyway, if you have that sort of dual role. And as Roger said, I think a lot of the social media, the Charity Commission social media guidance is actually quite useful in that regard. Then there are other things, if you are, if normally your duties would include sort of speaking on behalf of the charity, it might not be a good idea for you to sort of speak on political or policy matters while you're standing as a candidate. And then the other kind of big area would be, I think, thinking around decision making and whether it's appropriate for you to be involved in certain decisions. But essentially, all you're really trying to do is really mitigate that risk to the perception of a lack of independence by the charity. So really important to kind of just bring it back to that central question. If somebody external kind of like saw this, would they understand that actually this person is acting in an individual capacity, or does it look like it's potentially going to damage the reputation of the charity? So those are the things you need to consider. Next slide, please. And that's handing back over to Roger.
Thanks, Chris. So if we hop on to my my slide, so following on from a lot of what Chris really helpfully set out, I think that while there are undoubtedly a lot of rules for charities to consider, I sort of wanted to start this section with a positive, which is to say that elections are an opportunity. You probably won't find politicians more receptive and engaged and in listening mode than when they're seeking election. And it can be a time when issues and campaigns and discussions can be really impactful. And charities should speak up when it's in the best interests of the charity and its beneficiaries to do so. And they shouldn't sort of resile from advocacy because of the complexity of the rules or because of the risks of criticism. But it is vital that charities understand those rules, or they can, of course, easily end up in a difficult position. So for general elections, the law here is reasonably well known, the Political Parties Elections and Referendum Act, the beautifully named sort of PAPERA. And the key phrase that will run through this part of the talk is whether the actions of a charity can be reasonably regarded as intended to influence voting choice of parties or candidates. And that can include parties and candidates who hold particular opinions or advocate particular policies. It doesn't have to be divided on party lines. Because if you are doing that, that's what's known as regulated activity. So just pausing there for a second, you might well ask, given what Chris and I have just outlined, how can any charity ever carry out regulated activity that's intended to influence voting choice? It is a narrow gap, I would agree, but it covers campaigning activity that isn't explicitly supporting a party or a candidate, but perhaps just in its subject matter or the nature of the campaigning would be seen by a reasonable person as trying to influence voting choice. So what's regulated activity? The Electoral Commission, which is a very important regulator, you'll all be very familiar with the Charity Commission, but the Electoral Commission has a very important role here. And they set out that the nature, the tone, the timing can all affect whether a campaign is regulated activity, but it's ultimately just how a reasonable person would see it. Are you trying to influence voter choice, or are you only really focused on your charitable purposes, and anything else is sort of by the by? So as ever, a charity must maintain its independence, especially where its policies coincide with a political party. Chris is going to signpost all the really helpful guidance out there later on, but the Charity Commission's general guidance for charities and campaigning outside the regulated period gives the example of a housing charity which supported 100,000 new homes. Now that charity can outline the housing policies of each party, how many new homes each party is committed to building, but it mustn't explicitly call for people to vote for a party, and it mustn't explicitly compare its views favourably or unfavourably with political parties. Now, if in a manifesto, one party committed to building exactly 100,000 homes and the other committed to building exactly 0 homes, then it's quite hard to see how that could not be considered a pretty explicit attempt to influence voter choice. And that's no criticism of the guidance, which is really helpful, but I do just think it shows what a difficult area this is for charities to navigate. And we don't have this long stream of examples of case law. There aren't really many election prosecutions, and generally successful ones have been of sort of bad actors, not organisations acting in good faith, seeking to stay the right side of the line. And so quite understandably, many charities have taken a cautious approach. But we are in an era where in particular areas it's very difficult. And charities helping asylum seekers can clearly carry out justifiable political activity, but there are policies in the news that are so emblematic of government and party policy that it's easy to see how campaigning, which is quite legitimate under charity law, could, in an election period, tip over that balance and be perceived as intending to influence voters, and therefore it's regulated activity. And there are offences that could be committed here, in addition to potential sort of regulatory action from the Charity Commission. So this is not an area where charities want to be uncertain of their position. If we jump to the next slide, I'm just going to talk about how if you do conduct regulated activity, what the limitations are. So in terms of spending, you can spend up to £10,000 for UK charities. The rules are much tighter for overseas groups. So if you're part of an organisation that has sister organisations in the United States, they're limited to £700. So if you have an international dimension to your structure, you've got to look at it a bit more carefully. But if you're an English charity registered with the Commission, that's very easy. At 10,000, you must register as what's called a lower tier campaigner. So you don't have to report your spending, but you're still subject to the imprint rules that I'll talk about later. And then at 20,000, that's really the key threshold at which you have to register with the Electoral Commission as a non-party campaigner. Not many charities have done this, but at that threshold, you have to keep all your invoices, monitor and report your spending and your donations, and have particular controls on donations towards that activity, which must come from permissible UK donors. Once you're registered, in broad terms, you can spend up to £700,000. So it's quite a big gap there on UK-wide campaigning. And there are special rules about apportioning that between England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. 17,500 is allocated to each constituency, and there are further rules on like granular rules, which I won't go into the full detail of today. One big change that's fairly recent for those of you who've been across this issue before is that those thresholds have actually there's been a fairly hefty increase on what the old limits were. Once registered, there are also differing requirements above and below £250,000 of spending, and above that you have to also include an auditor's report. And there are lower limits for promoting a single party, promoting a single candidate, but that's irrelevant for charities because you can't do that anyway. Needless to say, if you're going to go above £20,000 on regulated activity, then it does need very careful strategic consideration and financial management, as well as that registration with the Electoral Commission. And any organisation that registers has to have a responsible person, a bit like a money laundering officer or similar, who's legally responsible for compliance with electoral law. So if we go to the next slide, the question that I imagine you're asking is, what is expenditure? Well, it's really quite wide. So material made available to the public, market research that you public, advertising, publishing in any media, holding public events, including the premises hire, the transport, the staff time, the expenses. So sending a tweet on X may sound like it's free, but actually it does take staff time. It's quite granular, and you can see that if a substantial national charity did undertake regulated activity, it would take very little indeed to breach the 10k and then the 20k thresholds. In smaller charities, spending £10,000 is quite a commitment. So you actually may find that if you were planning a campaign of £5,000, actually you don't really have to worry too much about the rules because you won't have to register. What's not regulated, what's not expenditure? So unpaid media interviews. If you're asked onto the BBC to give an interview, you're not paying for the slot, you're asked to go and give an interview, that's fine, that doesn't count. And volunteer time doesn't count as well. Another one is campaign material that's only made available to your members or supporters who've chosen to receive it. that's not regulated. So a mailing to your membership mailing list. Fair to say, I think, that for any charity to assume that any mailing can and will be seen by the media, so that's not carte blanche from a regulatory perspective to say whatever you want, but the costs of that email are not regulated. Be careful of common campaigns. The spending in a common plan between organisations is slightly counterintuitive. If 5 organisations pool their resources to spend a total of £25,000, they've all spent £25,000 and would all have to register. The average or the specific amount that your organisation contributes doesn't matter. And as I say, that seems to me counterintuitive. There is a rationale for it, but it's one to be a bit wary of. There are also new rules for digital imprints, which basically mirror the rules for printed literature. This requires identifying information to be contained on digital campaign materials. The rules are quite complex, but in summary, any digital material, which is election material or political material, has to include the name and address of the promoter and anyone else involved. Your sort of US politics style of, I am Jed Bartlett and I approve this ad. The wording's slightly different, but the principles are basically the same as the test for regulated activity. Is what you're publishing in digital media looking to influence how people will vote? So just bear in mind that no longer only applies to hard copy material. So just taking a step back, if you are going down this road of thinking, well, there's a good chance we might breach these spending limits, you clearly need a really careful strategy and documented decision-making in line with the decision-making principles set out in the Charity Commission's guidance, CC27, which the Commission refers to regularly in the context of all trustee decision-making. It's an easy thing for a lawyer to say, but don't forget other laws as well, in that there are in this context, this kind of campaigning, the law about defamation, advertising rule and regulation, data protection, IP infringement, and election law in general around the treatments of candidates that Chris mentioned around hustings. You will have to comply with all that as well. And it would be easy and it would be entirely understandable for any charity conscious of its resources and reputation to take a look at the complexity of the rules and opt out of non-party campaigning altogether. But for most charities, ignoring it's not an option, partly because it's incumbent on every charity to ensure it's complying with charity and electoral law. And that means coming back to that test and considering carefully published material during the regulated period to ensure that you do stay under the thresholds if that's your intention. But also coming back to what I said earlier, I think trustees have to consider what's in the best interests of the charity, and they cannot necessarily pause a major campaign or sort of sit out 2024 altogether. So it is important to understand the rules to allow you properly to carry out your purposes. Now, I'm going to hand back to Chris, but I'm very happy to answer any questions on that in the Q&A later on.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Roger. And just a few additional thoughts now from me on kind of like what this means, and again focusing, I think, on the what you can do question. So can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so I think this is a really important point to make, is that when you're weighing up as a charity how to campaign on things, when you're thinking about charity law, it's often sort of like prevents you from saying certain things or doing things in a certain way, or you've got to make the judgment that it might at least. Electoral law doesn't really stop you from doing any of that. The Electoral Commission don't care if you say these things. What they're interested in is how much of that kind of type of activity, which Roger set out, it is that you do. So I think just kind of remembering that there's nothing the Electoral Commission do which says, well, you can't say this, you can't do this. You've just got to like sort of bear in mind the limits to that. Next slide, please. And again, so Roger touched on this a little bit, this idea that again, one that comes up a lot for charities is if you are sort of approached by the press for a comment on something, then in that case you won't be it won't be regulated activity. There is a kind of exemption for that sort of activity. Essentially, it's when you kind of like organise those things yourself, say press conferences, for example, that are regulated, and they could count towards expenditure if you meet sort of all the other tests. But just it's useful to know that if you're just sort of giving a comment to the press, that's absolutely fine. It's not going to count against your expenditure. Next slide, please. And then Roger did went through very comprehensively kind of what all the thresholds cover. And so just a note here that most charities are therefore not going to be registering, and that's really been borne out by what's happened during elections, previous elections. So now what that means, I think, is that charities can take this quite proportionate approach. So yes, as Roger says, if you do a really kind of coordinated campaign, which involves lots of staff and is very clearly going against sort of like could reasonably be regarded territory, then you can very quickly meet that threshold. But for most charities, like most of the time doing the normal campaigning, you're not going to do it that much. And in particular, I think just like trying to avoid that scenario where people get very worried about, or well, if we post this on social media, we've kind of got to think about it when actually the kind of cost of an individual social media post, the kind of staff time cost is pretty low and isn't going to get you to sort of that threshold. So just a reminder that once you kind of like understand the rules, you can take that kind of quite proportionate approach. And next slide, please. But it's worth saying that there's absolutely nothing wrong with registering. If that's what's right, you think for your campaigning to carry out that activity, that regulated activity, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a charity registering, and you should go ahead and do it. Obviously, you need to do that kind of like intentionally and think about it strategically, but don't feel like, oh, well, if we do that, we'll have to register, so we can't do it. I think that's the really key point. Next slide, please. So just a bit of a kind of quick wrap up before we get on to Q&A. Thinking that's really the kind of question you really need to be asking is kind of what's in the best interest of the organisation, and making sure your campaigning reflects that. Yeah, again, as I think we both said, really important to know the law, even if you don't intend to campaign. My sense is the more you kind of like understand about the law, just the easier it is to react to things day to day, to kind of like avoid the things which are going to be questionable from a charity commission point of view, which could be regulated activity. And then there's also lots of guidance available. We'll signpost to a few more things at the end. But Charity Commission CC9 is always the place to go, I think, first of all, in terms of charity law around campaigning. But there is additional guidance around charities, elections and referendums, which is useful. And then the Electoral Commission, both looking at the new code of practice that's been published, but also the more detailed guidance, I think is really helpful. And again, as we've touched on a couple of times, the social media guidance that the Charity Commission published last year as well, very helpful, and I think identifying some of the challenges and conflicts. So I think we are now at the Q&A, so if we come to the next slide.
Brilliant.
Hand over to Lara.
Roger, Chris, thank you so much for those presentations. It was really interesting, really helpful to hear about. We have got some questions in the chat. Just so you know, if we don't reach your question, don't worry, we will respond to it in the follow-up email, because we've got some more coming in, which is fantastic. So just probably a really quick one here. Could you tell us what the regulated period of time is? When does that sort of start and finish?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the regulated period is 365 days up to polling day. Now, as you will therefore obviously have immediately worked out, we are in it for the current general election. So, and that was particularly relevant in the 2019 general election, when it was called obviously at very short notice. So everything we've said in terms of recording expenditure, if you are carrying out regulated activity, you're in it now. This isn't something you can sort of forget about until the election date is confirmed.
Perfect. Thanks, Roger. And we've got just a clarification question. And again, we can follow this up in the email. So it's written out. And we have got some resources on this. But somebody's just asked, can you just remind us, refresh us on what is the difference between regulated and unregulated? I know that might not be an easy one to answer in terms of the definition, but yes, if you can give it a reminder.
No, very happy to answer that. And I can see there's a couple of others in the chat that probably fall more within Chris's purview. So happy to answer this one.
Great, that's perfect.
The test is whether the campaign activity can be reasonably regarded as intending to influence voters to vote a particular way. So that's the test. It's not, are you saying something that lines up with a political party? It's not, are you saying things that are politically controversial? And it's not even, is what you're saying potentially affecting how people are voting? It's, are you intending it to influence
Brilliant.
how people are voting? Really, and even in that short explanation, it makes clear how difficult it is to analyze, and we could come up with 10 examples that all of us would disagree which side of the line it was on. So it's really difficult, but that's the definition.
Thank you, Roger. I think that is the difficult part, like you say, with the definition. The definition is clear, but how the definition is applied becomes really kind of challenging. I think this is a great question that we got from Charlie here to Chris, which I guess sort of slightly applies to some of this. So Charlie said, thank you so much for commenting on the policy, on how you comment on policies. But they've asked, if a party announced a policy in its manifesto that the charity has campaigned for already for a long time, and posted on social media about this, it was well known that they had campaigned on this, would it be okay to directly welcome the kind of position, the policy position on social media, e.g. by sharing the post with a suitable comment, or similarly commenting directly in the press? And I know you've talked a little bit about the press, assuming that they worded this in a constructive way and not directly party political. So Chris, I'm going to throw that one to you.
Yeah, so as we tend to when we get questions on this, it can be quite a grey area in terms of charity commission. I would say this is probably about as close as you can get to something which is like straightforwardly yes in this area. There's certainly be consideration if you have a long-standing approach on policy. It's unlikely then that you're changing your policy to accommodate a particular political party or because you favour a political party. And so welcoming that is absolutely fine, sort of whatever you do with that. The one caveat in this area is always that there's got to be one eye on, like, well, how might people perceive this? So things like, if you really focus on a particular party that has adopted recommendations and you were sort of like repeatedly referring to, well, does that then start to look a bit different? You've kind of got to come back to that. But yeah, certainly like a one-off welcome of a policy proposal, I think would be absolutely fine in pretty much all circumstances, really.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Chris. One that's a little bit similar that came in, and Roger, this was on your housing example. So with the housing example of kind of really drastically different policies of building lots of houses, not building any houses, does this mean charities are prevented from campaigning or discussing policy if one political party has policies which are too close or too far from their own aims?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, isn't it, Chris? Do you want to go first, and I'll
yeah, either of you.
Saying who should go first. Yeah, it is a good question. I'd be interested to see what you say, Roger, because I would say, like, I think no is the answer. I think you can still campaign on that, but it just makes it a bit harder, and you just have to bear more things in mind when you're doing that, and you just have to be really conscious of that possibility of, you know, aligning yourself more with one party or being seen to align yourself more with one party. As I don't know what you think on that.
I think that's right. I think if you're in an area which is, let's say, an area that's almost hard to think of one, but an area that's uncontentious between the parties, possibly something to do with some aspect of foreign policy that impacted the charity and where the parties were essentially aligned, then you would be able to be very relaxed about it. I think my view would, just on a pure risk basis, is the closer your policy exactly aligns with that of one of the major political parties, the more care is required. If one charity, taking the housing example, if one charity was committed to building homes, but had almost no policies around, say, rent reform and protecting the rights of renters, whereas another charity was not building homes, but was another party was not building new homes, but was really focused on defending and protecting the rights of those who rent to give them security of tenure, like commercial, then there would be a more sort of even-handed analysis, and you could again be relatively relaxed. I think, to take the example, if you're a housing charity whose policies line up identically with those of the Labour Party, then you do just have to be a bit more careful and just go to the extra lengths to make sure that no one looking at that could interpret it as saying vote Labour. And ultimately, the track record, I think, is helpful. If you've been banging the drum for 100,000 houses for 10 years, then it's much easier to justify than launching a brand new campaign in the middle of a general election period. That, I think, maybe I would caution against. So there's no one simple answer, but what I think we would, it certainly sounds like Chris and I are on the same page about is we're not saying you can't do it. We're just saying the closer you line up with a political party, the more thought, care, and attention you need to give to exactly the tenor and the wording of what you're saying.
Brilliant. Thanks, both of you. That's really helpful. We are getting close to time. I'm going to ask one more because I think it's a quick one. But just to say, the questions coming in now are amazing. They're really great. If you do have questions that you are really keen for our speakers to answer, please do throw them in the chat now, and I will make sure that we gather all of those and make sure that they are answered in the follow-up email. So please don't be put off by the fact that we're close to the end of the webinar. If you have a really pressing question, put it into the Q&A and I'll make sure that it gets answered in the follow-up. So one that probably may be of interest to quite a few, does encouraging people to register to vote count as intending to influence voter activity? Chris, shall I come to you for that one? Yeah.
Go first. So my understanding is no, actually, and in fact, I think I'm sure I've seen kind of like explicit support around this from the Electoral Commission. They absolutely want people to register to vote. Lots of charities will be involved, and they actively encourage charities to use their resources to get people to register to vote. So yeah, I think that's absolutely fine and not regulated activity.
Yeah, there's the UK Democracy Fund, I think, established by, driven by the Joseph Rowntree, there's a big sort of charitable project to get people to vote. The only note of caution I think I would say is that you still have to consider your charity's purposes and the best interests of the charity. And if you're run a community village hall, then a nationwide campaign to get people to register to vote obviously isn't in your purposes and best interest. So it's not sort of total carte blanche, but the principle, I think, is fine.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Roger and Chris. Your expertise are amazing. And I will be coming to you with the questions that are still coming through in the chat. And it's really exciting to see so many people engaged with this topic. Before we finally wrap up, we have got a last minute snap poll just to kind of find out about how you have found today. So if you can complete that when that pops up on your screen, that'd be really helpful. And also just to mention, when we close this or when you leave the webinar, you will also see an online evaluation form. We do really look at the evaluation and the feedback that we get. We use it to inform future webinars and future resources. So please do fill it in because we take the feedback from our members and our community and from charities that we're helping really seriously. Can I have the next slide, please? Brilliant. This is our final page, I think, for you guys in terms of where you can go for further support. So in terms of the support that NCVO provides, you will find that there is advice on general campaigning on our web pages, and Anna will pop that link in the chat for you so that you've got that. It will also be sent to you in an email so that you can follow up. The next one is a piece of work that we've done with NCVO, who are the infrastructure body for CEOs of the charity sector. And this is specific advice on political campaigning. This will give you a bit more time to read and take in some of the information that's been shared today, because it can sometimes feel a bit overwhelming. So please do visit those pages and take time to look through the law, to look through the guidance, to understand what regulated and unregulated activity is. And then the last two things that we've got, one is just about the support that we provide. Although it does, say, for small charities, you can access it if you are larger than what will be considered to be small. We take questions from across the sector, and if you do have them around this area, we're happy to send you more information and talk you through things. And we also have an excellent training course that is due to start on the 29th of April. It's a 2-day course that will be 29th of April and the 2nd of May on how to influence Parliament. And I can't recommend that enough. It is absolutely fantastic training. Chris, I believe you are the person that runs that. It is excellent. So I would really, really encourage you guys to sign up for that. Finally, to say thank you so much to all of our speakers today. Chris and Roger, you've been amazing. Thank you to everybody who has attended. That final QR code on there is if you are interested in membership. We would love to hear from you. Please do scan it or visit our website to join us. And if you have final questions, please do pop them in the chat before it closes. And we will close this down in about a minute or so. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've really appreciated you being here.